Hi, this is Joel Beckerman from Your Music, Your Future. Your Music, Your Future is really all about composers helping other composers in terms of understanding uh, really what your choices are in terms of compensation, other sorts of educational tidbits that are helpful for both new composers, first-time composers, and composers who've been doing this a really long time. Again, focused on education campaigns around these things. I am thrilled to have with us today Ashley Irwin, who is the president of the Society of Composers and Lyricists. Um, Welcome, Ashley. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thank you, Joel, for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
So, Ashley, I wonder if you could start out talking a little bit about the SCL. SCL has been around a long time, really helps composers in many, many different ways, in advocacy, also in education. But maybe you could speak a bit about the things that happen, behind the scenes, and also the things you might be aware of if you're a member and you're looking at the website. It's thescl.com, thescl.com.
Yeah. The SCL is a community, first and foremost, of music creators, high-level music creators and aspiring music creators. And everyone is treated the same. I know that sounds kind of strange, but in most cases, everybody mingles with everybody else. The only difference is some of the levels of membership are non-voting if you don't have any experience, but you're certainly mixing with professionals from the moment you join the SCL. The history of the SCL is an interesting one because it began as a union. It began in 1945 as the Screen Composers Guild of America, Composers Guild of America, sorry. And a few years later, it added Lyricists, the Lyricists Guild of America. And essentially what it was the union that was inside the studio system, that represented composers who were essentially going to work every day, sitting in a cubicle, writing their 2 minutes of music and going home at 5 o'clock and having a life with their family, much like any other office worker. That went on all the way through to the late 60s when the studios decided to push pretty much everyone out into the freelance world, not just composers, but all the craft people out into the freelance world. And the composers felt that if they were going to be independent contractors, they should be entitled to hang on to their copyrights and basically just license their music back to the studios, because virtually everybody else, except for the Writers Guild, I guess, they were creating intellectual property. But, the craftspeople that, build the sets and the teamsters, whatever, are not really, they're labor. So the situation, became a kind of a confrontational one, and the composers went on strike. It ran through the court system well into the 70s, and eventually they lost the case. The National Labor Relations Board deregistered them as a union, the CLGA, and out of the ashes of that, in 1983, about 200 composers started what is now the SCL, with no labor affiliation, no collective bargaining, and essentially just an organization, a support group, as I said, a community where we exchange information about what is going on in our industry as professionals. And that's kind of where we are today.
So you had mentioned composers keeping their copyrights. Can you speak? That, as we know, is not really the norm. Maybe you can speak about sort of what a typical deal is as compared to a songwriter deal.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I had to learn when I came here 32 years ago now, from Australia, was the difference in the way composers are engaged here to work on a film or a TV show. In Australia and much of the rest of the world, the composer does get to keep all or part of his, what we know in this country as the publisher share. And for all my television shows in Australia, I own everything. Unfortunately, most of them aren't on anymore anyway, so I don't see any money, but I still own the music and I own the masters and all of that. But here, once I came here, I had to learn the way the engagements are done here, and it's under what's called work for hire or work made for hire. And essentially what happens is the engaging production company, the people who ask you to write music, are considered the author in the eyes of the Copyright Office. And what happens is you start working on a project, and for all intents and purposes, you do own the copyright until you sign what's known as a certificate of authorship, which is essentially a document of assignment. It's pretty simple. It's a single page in most cases attached to a contract as an annexure. And that essentially assigns that copyright to the production company. And in the eyes of the Copyright Office, they become the author of that work. What that then entitles them to do is, obviously as owner of the copyright, they can synchronize it with their project and without any encumbrances from the composer. The real difficulty we have, and why we're always looking at ways to try and improve this situation for composers. But our work is a copyright inside another copyright. And so that copyright of the music goes inside the copyright of the film or TV show or video game or whatever it is. And that complicates the issue in terms of having either ownership or control. We've looked at ways to try and bifurcate the payments so that we don't necessarily want to control the copyright, but we do want to control our writer's share, so that it doesn't get moved around as has happened in the past, where production companies have essentially taken their catalogs and moved them from one performing rights organization to another. And we virtually have no control over things like that at the moment, but we're working on sort of trying to find solutions to that in Washington.
So if I can just kind of encapsulate it for a second, the typical deal, which has existed for nearly 100 years, composers get paid some kind of an upfront fee. In the past, that included the cost of musicians. Now, almost always it doesn't include the cost of musicians. That comes out of your synchronization fee up front. You give away essentially your copyrights with the understanding that you can collect 100% of your writer's share of public performance royalties through PROs. And as you said, right now, there's no guarantees that you can choose your own PRO, which is something that the SCL feels very strongly about, that ought to be written in the copyright. How am I doing so far?
You're right. Yeah, I mean, originally it was a fee for service, and all expenses were paid on top of that. But more commonly now, things are being made as a package deal, and it's not the best system because there's a from both sides. The composer obviously has to be very careful if he or she is going to make any money out of the deal, so they don't want to spend too much money on the project, which may jeopardize the quality of the music. Whereas the other side, the production company, basically will spend everything and leave the composer nothing to get the job they want. So you really need to, in these deals, try and delineate what is the composer's fee. Even if it is a package, try and delineate how many minutes you're expected to do for that, and what kind of instrumentation or how many recording sessions. I mean, as much as you can quantify to make sure you actually end up with some money at the end of the job.
So if you're a first-time composer straight out of university or straight out of creating an independent film, how do you learn about, what's the step one? How would I learn if I were a brand new composer some of these things just so I understand that I'm covered?
The first thing you have to realize is that music has value. And the reason people want it and want to control it is because it has value. If it didn't have any value, they wouldn't want to control it and own it. So as soon as you come to that realization, you then can determine how you're going to negotiate the value of that music with the prospective employer. And there are various ways to do that. Obviously, we've spoken about the work for hire that will give you, a fee or a package, and the ability to collect your performance royalty money whenever it's shown, somewhere on a TV screen, or there's no theatrical royalties in the US, but everywhere else in the world pays theatrical royalties. But you can also, there are other ways to do things, particularly on low budget and independent films when you're starting out, because you're not going to be working for a studio in most cases. You're going to be working for an independent kind of filmmaker, maybe someone you met at school, came across at college, answered an ad on a notice board somewhere. And, they may not have very much money for music. So how do you negotiate, and what can you get out of that? Well, it doesn't always have to be financial. It can be that you maintain ownership of that music and license it to the production. You can even create what we call as windows, where you say, okay, I'll give you this music for a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years, after which I have the ability to use it somewhere else or put it into a production library. There are so many permutations if you know what is available to you to negotiate, and what the value of that music is.
So you just touched on two things. One is the standard work for hire, which is for 100 years. That idea, again, that the composer would get a very small sync fee up front, the ability to collect performance royalties through the PRO system, hopefully of their choice. The second is a license where you own the music, or you might, seed some kind of uh, license for production to be able to use that music. But again, you own the copyright, just like a songwriter owns the copyright. The third is, can you talk about the third choice that people have, and that sort of the ramifications of that choice?
Well, let's just, before we go into that, there are two ways of licensing too. There is an exclusive license and there's a non-exclusive license. And the exclusive license means even though you own it, you can't reuse it somewhere else. And if they want that in a negotiation, then obviously they've got to pay a higher premium than if it's a non-exclusive license, which would allow you to move it elsewhere and you reuse it in some other form. The other way that you're talking about, I assume, is the total buyout altogether, which is just like you've gone to the supermarket and bought a box of Cheerios, and that's the end of the transaction. That's something that, look, it's a choice for everyone to make, and everyone in their course of their career will have different financial situations that they have to deal with. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all thing. But for me, a buyout, personally, I've never done a buyout on anything. I don't consider it a value, of long-term value. I don't know about you, Joel, but for me, all the music that I wrote that I thought was going to return me huge amounts of money returned me virtually, nothing like what I thought it was going to be. Yet the shows that I thought were just garbage, not garbage, but not as popular or would be as popular, they return me the most money. So we're living in an opportunity, or our opportunity is like the opportunity you have when you buy a lottery ticket. You really don't know. You really can't predict. And if you could predict, everybody would be millionaires. You wouldn't take on any other jobs. So I think just bearing that in mind, that alone is worth considering, that you really don't know what the life of a film or a show is going to be. I'll give you a great example. The old black and white I Love Lucy that's on everywhere, somewhere in the world, every day, right? The directors, I think from memory, the Directors Guild get 9 reuse payments for a show like that. So the director of any of those episodes, he probably timed out in the mid-60s. But the composer is still getting money. And his heir, I'm sure he's long dead, but Wilbur Hatch. But his heirs are still getting money for those works. I think a lot of people realized during COVID, for example, that check that comes kind of every so often, whether it's quarterly or half yearly, all the PROs play slightly differently. That check kept coming if you had stuff in the pipeline. For people who were doing hand-to-mouth existence, everything dried up for a year, everything. And I think that was, a real didactic moment for many composers to say, hey, maybe this isn't as good a deal as I want. Look, I understand if it's a young composer entering the field, and they have, they want to buy a house, they have college loan debts, they've got a young family or whatever, and it's very tempting to take the thing. And I would never tell anyone what they should do in their own personal situation. But for me, I've always found the long game a better game to play. So.
Yeah, I think I can do my own personal experiences. I've done 50 series and specials, and I would say 80% of the money I ever made in my career came from 5 of them. So,
Exactly.
yes, I think there are a lot of people who have similar experiences around that. So, but again, you point out people have a choice. The challenge sometimes we've heard, well, there's an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is a lot of the streaming services, for instance, Netflix, where a lot of people are saying they're being offered a buyout, which is all fine and good. That their position publicly is, if you say, I don't want to do a buyout, that they will allow you to do something through the PRO system. And I think if that's not the case, you certainly can point to their public statements and say, gee, have your ways of doing business changed? So I think it's just important, as you said, to be educated, to look at what's happening in the trades, to to the extent that you know someone who's an attorney, great. To the extent you know somebody who's a composer who's been doing this for a while and they have an attorney or they have an agent, and someone might be able to give you a little bit of extra information or take a quick look at your contract. Knowledge is power on these kinds of things, and I think allow people to do negotiations as you mentioned. Ashley,
So before you go on, I'll just to tack on to that. I mean, that's one of the things that the SCL is really good at, is that within our organization, I would even say within our board, just our board alone, our board of directors, everybody has encountered virtually everything that has ever happened in this business. And the number of times that people, young composers in particular, or even older composers who have not seen particular language in a deal before, will ask us, will come to us through one of our our online, we've got a portal, you can send in your question, it gets sent to the right person, we'll deal with it anonymously if you want to, we can refer you to people, but we can solve a lot of those things for you by, we say, hey, have you seen this before? Is this normal? They're asking me to do this. I say, no, that's not normal. That's not what it should be. And you should go back. And you can even use us to stand behind and say, hey, I spoke to the people at the SCL and they haven't seen this kind of language before. It's just kind of new or whatever. So that's a real service that we can provide particularly for entry-level composers who
Yeah.
haven't had a lot of experience.
So maybe you can talk a little more, Ash, about quickly list off, because there are so many services that the SCL provides that people would know about, plus the activities the SCL is engaged in that are behind the scenes that people may not all know about.
Sure. Well, the outwardly facing things are our events. Obviously, we have um, celebratory events where we have receptions for Emmy nominees and Oscar nominees that are, generally our members, but sometimes, particularly if they're from overseas, we include them in our celebrations. We don't leave anybody out. It's all part of the same thing. This year, we hosted our third SCL Awards ourselves, where we've had our huge success with this new awards format, where it's only voted on by people who write music, and it's the only organization where that is the case from beginning to end through the process. All of the other academies have other people in the loop that don't write music at some point in the process. And so that's been embraced by the studios as well, because it's quite often becomes a calling card if you've won an SCL award to go to the next step, whether it's an Oscar or an Emmy or whatever. We're seeing a trend. So we're sort of setting the stage in a lot of areas.
And now a Grammy.
Now Grammys.
Now Grammys.
Yeah.
Australia.
And even Gang Awards too, even the Video Game Awards. So they're the outward things, and then obviously there's seminars and workshops that we do. The last few years we've been locked into Zoom, obviously, like everyone. And I think we'll go forward. That'll be a hybrid model from now on, because what we've discovered is that it brings our chapters, like we have, LA and New York, and we've just started Nashville. It means that everybody can participate in a Zoom session where they can, whereas a physical session is a little more, restrictive. However, we do, as long as the venue that we're at can cope, we do stream our events. And if we can't stream them, we record them and archive them, and they're all there. And they go. There's some incredible archival stuff on our website with composers that go back to the beginning, go back to the 80s. With Morricone and Jerry Goldsmith, and like people that are really, really, Mancini, people who've made, really set the stage for our profession. We also have mentor programs for young entry-level people that we give them an opportunity to work with, or to meet rather with professionals in the field, not just composers. They meet with a lot of composers and songwriters, but they also meet with attorneys and music supervisors and music editors and orchestrators and contractors and agents and publicists. So they start to put together how all the pieces fit when you're building a team. If you're going to be a professional in this business, who do you need, and how do they interface with each other in your little world? And we run those in LA and New York, and obviously we'll be starting the one up in Nashville as soon as that gets going down there.
Yep. When I had started with your support, the New York chapter, I remember that was the first thing we stole from LA, because it's just enormously successful and valuable for composers to see how these things work end to end.
Well, you have such a great smorgasbord, really, of music schools in New York. I mean, my goodness, from NYU, which I know a lot of the guys that are still on the steering committee there teach at NYU, and Manus and Manhattan and now Firestein and the New School. I mean, it just goes on. Columbia, I mean, Juilliard. There's a lot of them there. So that's the problem. The problem we keep encountering with New York is that as soon as they graduate, they all come out to LA. And they don't. A lot of them don't stay in New York, but that's the new crop comes in, the new crew. And so then we have screenings, and those screenings have Q&As always with the composers and often the director or the showrunner. So you start to really understand how people interact on a show or on a movie. And once again, they're all archived so people can refer to them, whatever. So that's all our outward stuff. But then there's so much other stuff under the hood that goes on that's very hard to sort of quantify, as it's happening, because a lot of it moves very slowly, but it's all moving in a direction. And those things are, well, there's two levels really. There's what's going on in Washington, and then there's what's going on with our alliances with other organizations, both here and around the world. And to talk about Washington first a little bit, we work very closely. We have a representative in Washington who works for the American Continental Group, which is a lobbying firm, and she deals with all of our anything to do with IP interests. She's all over it because she represents Sound Exchange. She also represents the Authors Guild. She represents the Songwriters Guild of America, and therefore she has a great grasp of IP, intellectual property. So anything that comes across that's going on over there, I mean, I had yesterday, for example, I had 9 meetings with senators and representatives, officers, chiefs of staff for some bills that are in process that will affect our rights on the internet, and getting access to those and getting them all lined up in one day is really quite astonishing. We deal with the Copyright Office a lot. We deal with the Department of Justice a lot. We're working on different things in different places. One of the things we're working on at the Copyright Office, and Joel, you've been up there with me several times over the course of the years, trying to quantify or codify rather the writer's share in the Copyright Act, so it isn't appearing in our contracts as customarily known as, but it's actually a defined piece of business, which at the moment a lot of people don't know. It's not defined. The writer's share is just a custom. It's not an absolute, and we'd love to get it to be an absolute like it is in most countries around the world. There's no less than 50% of the revenue derived from the works.
So I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, sorry,
just to say, this is one of the things that Your Music, Your Future has a great crossover with the SCL from the standpoint of recognizing these things are global issues. Certainly they start from, for us, for the SCL, and certainly for Music Your Future, for Your Music, Your Future, they start from US issues. We recognize that these issues around where we're not getting necessarily what we need to from a compensation standpoint, those provide challenges in terms of when composers are making decisions. They're causing challenges in terms of composers understanding in a lot of ways what the differences are between buyouts and being able to keep your writer's share. And again, these are US focused, but then have global implications. You mentioned the other organizations that the SCL is very integrated in, and they're very important, but maybe you can talk about also ex-US, because the SCL is very involved in things outside of the United States.
Yeah, we have, as I say, alliances in North America with through a partnership of creator organizations, both songwriter and score composers in Canada and the US, called Music Creators North America, and that is the North American Continental Alliance member of SIAM, which is the international umbrella group of all music creator groups around the world, and they represent in total over 500,000 music creators. There's as I say, there's 5 partner alliances from the continental, from the various continents, and we actually have a conference. We had one last week, actually, an international conference via Zoom. The last in-person one we had was in Budapest in end of 2019, where I sat with the business affairs person from Netflix and discussed a lot of this stuff in terms of working with the various ways copyrights handled in territories around the world. It's very different in Europe to what it is here, primarily because here there are multiple societies, multiple collection societies. In most countries, other countries, there's a single society representing the collection for composers, and it seems to it means that there is something that's called exclusive assignment, whereby you can sign up to that society and know that you're protected by that exclusivity. Whereas here, because of the consent decrees, there is no exclusivity. You cannot join. You cannot exclusively assign your music to a society. It's a non-exclusive license. For reasons I won't go into now, it's too complicated. But the situation with the international group, what came out of that Budapest conference was an international AV working group. And that working group got together, and we meet every, I want to say, 4 to 6 months. And we bring each other up to speed on what developments have happened in each territory and how they impact us. And what we've discovered is that the American model, even though it's in many countries, particularly Europe, where they have these things called moral rights, cannot be applied. A lot of these producers are trying to use the American model to take over the ownership of much more of the revenues generated by that performance of music than they otherwise would. So unfortunately, the American system is starting to permeate, and we're trying to everything we can to stop that happening.
And that's again, the SCL does an amazing job about education. We're focused specifically, Your Music, Your Future, on this one sliver around buyouts and understanding that as a global issue. Ash, I want to go back to something you said earlier, which is about holding the value of the music you create. And it strikes me and others that without us, without the music we create, there is no Netflix. There are no movies. There is no cable or network television. So I think it's really important that we all remember that we're not here to be grabbing for crumbs or whatever falls off the table. That what we do creates tremendous value, and it's important for us to hold on to that as individuals and also from the standpoint of a group. I think when we talk about this, this is one of the reasons I think we need to stand up for ourselves in terms of our options about how we get paid. So if you can talk, Ashley, just for a moment, specifically around the issues around agents. And again, sometimes people own their own copyrights, which is maybe not such a frequent event with most composers. But let's talk about the role of agents and sort of where we are in those relationships right now in this time.
Agents are they're certainly necessary if you're working at any particular level, and until you can get to that level, you're either going to have to do your own negotiations, which can be uncomfortable when you're trying to have an artistic relationship and a business relationship at the same time. It can sometimes be uncomfortable, which is where you might bring in an attorney to negotiate, but that attorney is going to cost you money and your budget may not allow for that. So it's a real, it's a real conundrum when you're starting out, and which is why you really do need to educate yourself as much as you possibly can. But when you get to the point where you are working with an agent, I say to people who immediately say, well, I need an agent. I'm not going to get work unless I have an agent. And it's kind of the reverse of that. when you have work, agents will come to you to represent you. You kind of have to start getting your own work first to prove that you have clients, or at least one client. A good way to begin a relationship with an agent is to, if you do get a job, and a lot of agents will do a one-off deal for you without signing you, just to see how the relationship works out, and if that leads to something else, you can eventually get onto their roster. Now, the agents all have different ways of doing things and different percentages that they pay. Anywhere, the client will pay anywhere between generally 10 and 20%, depending on the level of client you are, in terms of where you are in the pecking order of A list to B list to C list, and what you're bringing in revenue wise.
So fair to say a lot of these things that have been accepted practice for a long time, some of those are now in flux and trying to sort that out.
Well, they are, yeah. And one of the things that, I'm not to champion Netflix or any of these streaming services in any way, but Netflix is a unique model, and therefore I think, I won't say you have to cut them some slack, but you have to observe them through a different prism. Netflix is the first company, to my knowledge, that has production hubs all over the world. I mean, studios generally look, when they make a product out of the US, look for distributors on the ground in each territory. That's not so much the case with Netflix. They've got 14 or 15 or 19, I can't remember, production hubs around the world, where they make local content to satisfy quotas in those territories, as well as distribute their US content. And therefore, I understand, as much as I don't necessarily agree with it, I understand their want or need or desire, or whatever verb you want to stick in there, to have a one-size-fits-all music thing going on. But the reality is that the territorial relationships between the composers and their societies really doesn't permit that. It just doesn't permit it. And it's not going to permit it. So it's kind of a weird approach for me to think that they are going to be able to create a one size fits all without changing all the rules in every society around the world. It's just
yeah, complex again. So I did want to wrap up and just talk about one thing that both Your Music, Your Future and the SCL had been very intimately involved in. And, look, this is an extreme case. But there was an issue with the Discovery Networks a number of years ago where there was a bit more of an overt, let's use the word, it's a bit of a threat to composers who maybe had been working across a number of the 24 networks that Discovery covers. And what was essentially said to people is, look, if you don't give up your performance royalties in the US, gee, we're not going to pay any more upfront anyway. You can't really work across our 24 networks, which for a lot of people, that was and is their livelihood. What happens with composers when that piece, again, the deal had been, you can own the copyright, we get to collect 100% of the writer's share of the performance royalties. And when the composers give their part and the studios don't, understanding what we have to pay, what benefits we may not get as independent contractors, and sort of help people understand a little bit about that model and what happens when the performance royalties disappear.
The problem that we have as composers, and once again, it gets back to this being independent contractors, is that we do not have any collective bargaining other than standing united on certain issues like this. We don't have health insurance. We don't have pensions. The closest thing we have to pensions are our royalties, if we hang on to them, that hopefully will provide for us as we accumulate them, and they get older. We get older and they get older. But as I said with the I Love Lucy example, some of these things may kick around for years and years and years. But that's the best we have. Now, we're working in Washington with a larger group of like organizations, the Authors Guild, the graphic artists, the science fiction writers, the songwriters, the photographers, all these little groups that create intellectual property and are not unions or guilds in any collective labor sense, to try and find a way where we can not necessarily be in violation of any kind of antitrust laws where we are considered to be price fixing or colluding or any of that sort of stuff, and create a third category which would allow us to get some of these things, which would be a creative independent. And at the moment, there's independent contractor and employee. This would be a creative independent, and it would allow us to at least be able to, discuss the idea of setting some working conditions and setting some going together and getting some group health insurance and any number of other things. So, that's one of the things that we're just another one of the things that's going on behind the scenes. But yeah, I mean, look, our copyrights, our royalties, they are our pension, and there's really no other way to say it. I mean, that's kind of what it is.
And I think just the where the Discovery situation ended up was they rethought their position. They went back to the way they had been working before, and really it was the nature of all these composers willing to step up and say, look, this is not livable. It's not a viable situation. Ultimately, it's really not good for the studios or for the for the audiences, because everyone needs and wants the best music for television series and films that they can possibly get, because that's entertainment, which is one of the huge export for the US. So I think ultimately, although it seemed like one party lost, I think everyone really won. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, what's really important for us to remember.
Well, yeah, and everything that's withdrawn from the current collection model weakens the overall ecosystem in some way. It just does, because it empowers people outside the system, and I don't just mean studios or composers, or it empowers all sorts of other people. I'll be honest and say we have mixed feelings about some of the stories we're hearing coming out of Warner Brothers since the merger with Discovery. There are stories going on in not just, I haven't heard any about music yet, but I have heard them about profit participation on other levels with show producers, that they're doing away with some deals over there. Once again, it's anecdotal, but it could be the tip of the iceberg. It may be something we have to confront again in the near future, Joel. I mean, you just don't know.
And and I think, Ash, and I think you'd agree with this, the idea is for the SCL and also for Your Music, Your Future, I don't think any of us expect that the industry will be frozen in amber and never change. Gee, it was this for 100 years and now it's going to be exactly the same going forward. I don't think that's the anticipated outcome, but the anticipated outcome is for people to be educated so they understand their choices, and to have a lot of organizations that represent composers and song and music creators like the SCL, which, by the way, is the only organization of its kind. I have SCL blood in my veins. As I said before, I don't think I'd have a career without what I learned from the SCL. But Ashley, thank you so much for joining and discussing all these issues, telling us a little more about the SCL and where people might get started. Again, thescl.com. I really encourage you to become members. I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned. Even if you're an ex-US composer, there's still a tremendous amount to be learned. And also, thank you for being a part of and supporting Your Music, Your Future, yourmusicyourfuture.com. We just broke through 20,000 supporters, which we're very excited about.
Fantastic.
Through our thank you, and through our relationship with CISAC, which is sort of the hub and spokes of of PROs around the world. We're now in 106 countries. So again, thank you so much, Ashley. Cannot tell you how much I appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure, Joel. Anytime. So
Okay.
I hope this gets a lot of views and a lot of people ask questions and come to the SCL and ask us, because that's why we're here.
As soon as they know it's you, there'll be a lot of hits. Thanks again.
All right, man. See
Appreciate
you
it.
later.
Okay.